An old man gave his last food to a wild horse. What the herd did next shocked everyone. What makes a man standing on the brink of death share his last piece of bread not with another human being, but with a wild animal? The village of Sukhodolye learned the answer to this question at a price no one was willing to pay. The sun hung over the scorched steppe not as a source of life, but as a red-hot executioner's axe. It hadn't rained for 3 months. The earth cracked, turning into a mosaic of dusty gray polygons. The river that once watered the entire village became a dusty ditch where the bones of small animals gleamed white. The air trembled from the heat, and even the sound seemed viscous and muffled. In the dead silence of midday, something happened that marked the beginning of the end, or the beginning of something new. She appeared out of the haze on the horizon. She wasn't walking, but rather shuffling her feet, swaying from exhaustion. A wild horse. Her sides were so sunken that you could count her ribs from 20 paces away. Her dirty, tangled mane hung in shreds, and her large, dark eyes were frozen with a single emotion: the agony of death. She reached the central square, where a dried-up public well stood, and collapsed to the ground. Dry clay flew up in a cloud of dust. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. The huts, which had previously seemed uninhabited, came to life. Doors creaked. People began to emerge into the square. Their faces were as parched as the ground beneath their feet. Stepan Gromov, the local elder, was the first to approach the horse. Broad-shouldered and solid as a rock, he was the embodiment of the harsh necessity of the times. He glanced at the animal with a short, masterful look and delivered a verdict that brooked no argument. "We have to drive her away." His voice was hoarse and authoritative. "She has no strength left. She'll die soon. She'll only bring disease here. Men, grab your sticks." Several men, just as sullen and desperate, reluctantly moved to carry out the order. They surrounded the lying horse, but it did not even raise its head. It simply did not have the strength to be afraid. At that moment, Grandfather Zakhar came out onto the porch of his house at the end of the row. The 78-year-old man, who looked like a dried-up tree, watched what was happening with his strikingly clear blue eyes. He didn't say a word, not to Stepan, not to the men. He just turned around and disappeared into the dark doorway of his house. "That's right, old man. Don't get involved." Stepan grunted approvingly, but his words were drowned out by the general amazement. Zakhar reappeared. In one hand he held an old galvanized bucket with water sloshing around in the bottom, his daily ration. In the other hand, he held a dark, almost black lump, the last crust of bread. In full view of the entire village, which stood frozen in bewilderment, the old man approached the horse. He was not afraid. He knelt down on one knee next to its head, crumbled the bread into the bucket of water, and carefully brought it to the animal's cracked lips. The horse snorted, catching the scent of moisture and food. With incredible effort, it raised its head and eagerly poked its muzzle into the bucket. The desperate slurping sounds broke the dead silence. Stepan watched, his face frozen. "What are you doing, Matveyich?" he hissed. "That's your last water. Our children want a drink, and you're watering wild animals? Have you completely lost your mind?" Zakhar did not answer. He just stroked the horse's neck with his gnarled hand until it emptied the bucket. He saw a spark of life break through the deep apathy in its eyes. That was more important to him than the words of the village head and the condemning glances of his neighbors. When the bucket was empty, the horse was able to get up. It stood unsteadily, but it was on its own legs. The animal turned its head and looked straight at Zakar. It was a long, meaningful look, in which there was nothing animalistic. Then it turned and walked slowly but confidently away from the village, back into the steppe haze. "Well, that's it," Stepan spat out angrily. "You fed it and gave it water, and it didn't even say thank you. Now starve to death, you weirdo. You made your choice." He looked around the crowd with a heavy gaze. "And don't let me see this again. Our survival is the law. Anyone who opposes it is an enemy to all of us." The people dispersed silently, casting sidelong, frightened glances at Zakar. He was left alone in the empty square with his empty bucket. On that day, he became an outcast in his own village. Elena, his young neighbor, saw everything from her window. She hugged her little son and cried. She felt sorry for both the horse and the old man, but she was too afraid of the village head to intervene. At night, she secretly brought Zakar a mug of milk left over from her son. "Take it, Matveyich," she whispered. "You can't be like this." The old man just shook his head, but took the milk. "Thank you, daughter," he replied quietly. "Kindness is like water in the desert. Even a drop can save a life." 3 days passed. 3 days of absolute heat and despair. Zakar's deed was almost forgotten against the backdrop of a new, far more terrible misfortune. The small spring outside the village, which had provided water for the few animals that remained, had dried up. The last thread connecting Sukhodolye to life was severed. In the morning, people gathered around the dirty puddle that had been their hope just yesterday. Now it was just wet earth. There was no anger on Stepan's face, only cold, calculating fury. "That's it," he said hoarsely. "We can't wait any longer. Grab your shovels. We're going to dig a new well, where the old riverbed used to be. The water should be deep there." It was a desperate measure. Digging rocky, parched earth under the scorching sun was hellish work with little chance of success. But there was no choice. The men worked all day. Shovels scraped against stones, sweat poured into their eyes, and their muscles ached from the strain. They dug a hole 2 men high, then 3. The earth was dry as gunpowder. By evening, when the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood, the inevitable happened. One of the men's shovels struck a rock with a dull thud. It was the end. The hope that had kept them going all day died in an instant. The men climbed out of the pit in silence. They did not look at each other. Stepan remained standing at the edge, staring into the useless hole in the ground. His shoulders, always straight and confident, slumped. For the first time in all this time, he looked defeated. The village was plunged into silence, even more terrifying than before. It was the silence of a graveyard. People sat in their homes, knowing that these were their last days. They had only enough water left for a day, maybe 2. After that, there would be a painful death. Grandfather Zakar also sat on his porch, staring at the crimson sunset. He felt neither hunger nor thirst, only a strange, all-consuming calm. He had done what he had to do, and if this was the end, he would accept it. But fate had other plans. At dawn the next day, he was awakened by a strange rumbling. It was low, barely audible, and seemed to come from the ground itself. Zakar went out into the yard. The sky to the east was clear, but above the horizon, where the steppe merged with the sky, something strange was rising. It wasn't a cloud. It was too dark, too dense, and moving too fast. It grew with every second. turning into a giant wall of dust rushing straight toward the village. The rumbling was followed by a pounding sound. At first it was quiet, like distant drum beats, but it grew louder, turning into a thunderous roar of thousands of hooves. Panic broke out in the village. People ran out of their houses, screaming, not understanding what was coming toward them. Stepan rushed out into the street with his hunting rifle. "Everyone get inside! It's a herd!" he shouted, his voice betraying fear for the first time. But this was no ordinary herd. As the wall of dust drew nearer, the villagers froze in terror. Hundreds, if not thousands, of wild horses were galloping toward Sukhodolye. It was like a living avalanche, ready to wipe their village off the face of the earth. And at the head of this unstoppable force, next to a huge black stallion, ran her, the very mare that grandfather Zakhar had saved. Panic gave way to paralysis. The deafening avalanche of sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The clatter of hooves fell silent. The huge herd froze 100 meters from the outermost hut, as if it had stumbled upon an invisible wall. The air, thick with dust, slowly settled, revealing a sight that took people's breath away. Thousands of horses stood in a dense, living wall. They showed no aggression. They just stood and stared. Their breathing merged into a single, powerful hum, like the sound of distant waves. In front, like two statues, stood the raven-colored stallion, and next to him, the mare saved by Zakhar. Her sides were still sunken, but there was no weakness in her stance. There was strength and an incomprehensible, almost regal calmness. Stepan Gromov lowered his rifle, unable to believe his eyes. His pragmatic mind refused to accept what he was seeing. A herd of wild horses could not behave like this. They should have either rushed past or broken into the village in search of water, sweeping away everything in their path, but they stopped. "What do they want?" Someone behind him croaked. The question hung in the hot air. "Everyone stay where you are. Don't make any sudden movements." Stepan's voice trembled, but he quickly regained his composure. He was the village elder, the leader. He couldn't show fear, even when he felt an icy chill running down his spine. "They smell water," he concluded, as logically as he could. "Our supplies. They want a drink. They'll hang around for a while and then leave." But they didn't leave. An hour passed. The sun rose higher, and the heat became unbearable. The horses stood motionless. People hid behind fences and in doorways, afraid to move. The village turned into a besieged fortress. The tension grew. It was thicker than dust, denser than the heat. Children began to cry in their homes, and their cries echoed through the dead silence, forcing their mothers to cover their mouths with their hands. Grandfather Zakhar was the only one who did not hide. He stood on his porch, leaning on his cane, and looked at the herd. He saw no threat. He saw something else, something that escaped the gaze of the others. He saw order in the chaos. He saw intelligence in the eyes of the black leader. By noon, people's patience began to wear thin. Thirst tormented them more than fear. "Stepan, we have to do something," shouted one of the farmers. "We're all going to die of thirst. Maybe we should fire a shot in the air to scare them off?" Stepan hesitated. Scare this living mountain? One shot could cause panic, and then they would surely be wiped out. "Quiet," he barked. "Wait, they don't have any water either. They won't stay like this for long." But he was wrong. The horses began to behave strangely. The leader stamped his hoof on the ground several times. Then again. The other horses in the front ranks joined him. They stamped their hooves in the same direction, toward the dry bed of an old stream where the men had tried in vain to find water yesterday. It was like some kind of ritual. The insistent, methodical pounding echoed throughout the village. Elena peeked out from behind the curtain and saw that Zakar had left his yard and was walking slowly along the fence, his eyes fixed on the horses. Her heart sank with fear for him. "Matveyich, come back. It's dangerous," she whispered. But he didn't hear her. The old man stopped at the very edge of the village, closest to the herd. The mare he had saved separated from the leader. She took a few steps forward, halving the distance between her and the old man. She raised her head and let out a soft, melodious whinny. It was not a call or a threat. It was a plea. She looked straight at Zakar, and her gaze clearly showed that she was waiting for something. At that moment, everyone in the village understood. It was all because of him. The horses had come for him. Whispers spread through the crowd. He brought them here. The old sorcerer. He brought trouble upon us. Fear quickly found someone to blame. People who had condemned the old man just yesterday now looked at him with hatred. He was the reason for their captivity, their fear, their thirst. Stepan understood this too. He saw the connection, but his conclusion was different. "They didn't come for him," he said hoarsely, more to himself than to anyone else. "They brought him here." But where? He looked again at the spot where the horses were pawing the ground, at the useless, rocky earth. It was madness. Time passed. The sun began to sink toward the horizon. Nothing changed. The horses stood still. People waited. Despair gave way to apathy. Night was coming, and with it a new horror, the unknown. What would these thousands of animals do in the dark? Stepan could wait no longer. The responsibility weighed on him like a stone slab. He made a decision. "Enough," he said firmly, raising his rifle. "I won't stand by and watch my village die. I'll fire a warning shot. If they don't leave, I'll shoot to kill. Who's with me?" Several men with pitchforks and axes hesitantly stepped toward him. It was suicide, but doing nothing was even worse. Zakari, hearing his words, turned around. Their eyes met across the square. There was no fear or reproach in the old man's gaze. Only deep, universal sadness. He seemed to be saying, "Don't do it, son. You don't understand." But Stepan had already bitten the bullet. He slowly raised the gun to his shoulder, aiming at the sky above the black stallion's head. The women screamed. Elena closed her eyes. A shot rang out. A sharp, deafening sound broke the thick silence. Birds, if they were still there, would have flown into the sky. But the sky was empty. The echo of the shot rolled across the steppe and died away. Silence fell once more. People held their breath, waiting for a reaction. Panic, a roar, a deadly lunge forward. But nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. The black stallion did not even twitch an ear. The entire 1,000-strong herd stood as immovable as before the shot. They seemed not to notice this pathetic attempt by a man to prove his strength. This imperturbability was more frightening than any aggression. It showed the futility of human efforts. It broke something inside Stepan. He slowly lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. He, Stepan Gromov, whom everyone feared and respected, was just a speck of dust in the face of this silent, primitive power. And at that moment, when the last hope for strength and power collapsed, Grandfather Zakar took a step forward. Then another. He stepped out of the village and alone, with only his staff in his hand, walked toward the living wall of horseflesh. "Matveyich, stop! Where are you going? They'll eat you!" Stepan shouted after him, mad with fear. But the old man did not turn around. He walked straight toward the huge black leader who stood motionless, like a black rock, waiting for him. The village froze, turning into a silent audience. Every breath, every rustle seemed sacrilegious in the ringing silence. Grandfather Zakar walked, not quickly, not slowly. His old broken boots kicked up small clouds of dust. He did not look to the sides, at the frightened faces of his neighbors, who just yesterday had shared bread with him and today were ready to tear him apart. He looked only ahead, at the black mountain of muscles and wild fury embodied in the stallion leader. There was no fear. There was only a sense that what was happening was right, as if his entire long life had led him to this moment, to this line between the world of humans and the world of nature. 100 meters? 50? 20? Now he could see every muscle rolling under the leader's coat, glistening in the sun. He could see his nostrils flaring, drawing in air. He could smell the pungent, sharp scent of hundreds of horse bodies, the smell of sweat, dust, and the open steppe. He stopped 10 steps away from the stallion. To go any further would have been madness. Any horse breeder knew that the leader of a wild herd was not just an animal. He was a king, a protector, the embodiment of absolute power. One wrong move, one wrong look, and he would be trampled to dust before he could even cry out. But Zakar stood calmly, leaning on his staff. He didn't try to speak. He didn't try to do anything. He just waited. And the leader looked at him. His eyes, black as agate, were not filled with malice, but with primitive wisdom. He studied this strange, small, two-legged old man who did not smell of fear. At that moment, the mare Zakar had saved stepped forward and stood between him and the old man, slightly covering him with her body. She snorted softly, and the sound, directed at the leader, was understood without words. He is one of us. He will not harm you. The leader blinked slowly, and then the incredible happened. The wall of horses, which had stood as a monolith, faltered. The horses standing to the left and right of the leader took a step to the side, forming a narrow, living corridor. A passage, an invitation. The people in the village gasped. This was beyond comprehension. It defied all the laws of nature they knew. It was like a miracle or witchcraft. Stepan Gromov, still standing with his useless rifle in his hands, felt a chill run down the back of his neck. He saw Zakar, without hesitating for a second, step into the corridor. The old man walked through a 1,000-strong herd. He felt the hot breath of the animals on his skin and heard their quiet snorting. He could reach out and touch any of these powerful, wild creatures. But he kept walking, looking only ahead, where his rescued mare was leading him. She brought him to the very spot on the dry riverbed, to that patch of earth where dozens of horses had trampled with their hooves. There she stopped and looked at him again. Zakar dropped to his knees. The ground here was as dry and hard as everywhere else. He placed his palm on it. No moisture. He put his ear to the ground, as he had done in his distant youth when searching for water for his herd. Silence. But the old man knew that horses could not be wrong. Their instincts, honed by thousands of years of survival in the steppe, were more accurate than any human device. They didn't just stamp their hooves for no reason. They heard or felt something that was inaccessible to him. He looked up at the mare. She shifted impatiently from foot to foot and stamped her hoof again, exactly in the same place. And then Zakar understood. He wasn't looking for moisture. He was looking for a sound. The horses weren't showing him where the water was. They were showing him where there was nothing. Where beneath the hard, baked crust of earth, there was not a monolithic rock, but something else. Perhaps an old, silted-up underground stream bed that had not yet had time to petrify. He slowly got to his feet. His face was calm, but his faded blue eyes burned with understanding. He turned around and walked back, just as calmly, through the living corridor that had opened up again in front of him. The herd stood motionless, waiting. When Zakar emerged from the circle of horses and stepped back onto the village ground, he seemed like a different man. Not a bent old man, but a messenger bringing the last hope. He walked straight up to Stepan. The village elders stared at him, not knowing what to say. His world, built on logic and strength, had crumbled to dust. "There's water there," Zakar said simply. His voice was quiet, but it rang out louder than a gunshot in the dead square. He pointed his staff to the spot where the mayor had been standing. "You need to dig there." Stepan blinked. "What?" "Matveyich, we dug there yesterday. 5 meters from there. There's a rock. You saw it yourself." "You didn't dig there," the old man repeated stubbornly. "The horses know. Dig where they showed you." An indignant murmur ran through the crowd. "He's gone mad. He's making us work for animals. It's a trap. He wants us to leave the village so they can trample us." Fear and mistrust took hold again. Elena gathered her courage and stepped forward. "What if he's right?" Her voice trembled, but everyone could hear her. "What do we have to lose? We're dying anyway. Maybe this is our only chance?" Stepan looked at her, then at the hateful faces of his fellow villagers, then at the old man, whose eyes were filled with unshakable confidence. And then he looked at the herd. They were still standing there, waiting, as if giving the people one last chance to make the right decision. It was madness. Absolute pure madness. To trust an old eccentric and wild animals against all common sense. But common sense had led them to the rock and to utter despair yesterday. Maybe it was time to try madness? Stepan clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white. He felt the eyes of the entire village on him. They were waiting for his words. The words of the village elder. He slowly turned to the men standing with shovels by the useless hole they had dug yesterday. His face was like a mask of stone. "Take your pickaxes," he breathed. And no one could tell if there was despair or a glimmer of crazy hope in his voice. The decision was made. The air, which had been buzzing with tension, was filled with a new sound, the scraping of metal against stone. The 5 strongest men, including Stepan himself, with grim determination on their faces, headed toward the dry riverbed. They walked as if to their execution, not believing in success, but obeying the last irrational will of their leader. The herd did not move. The horses stood like silent judges, watching every movement of the men. Grandfather Zakar remained at the edge of the village, leaning on his staff. He did not give orders or advice. His mission was accomplished. Now everything depended on whether the men had enough faith and strength. Stepan was the first to drive the pickaxe into the ground. The blow was dull and sticky. The baked clay yielded reluctantly. "Here." He pointed to the spot where the hoof of the rescued mare had left the deepest mark. "Let's start here." The work began in earnest. This was not yesterday's desperate labor. Today, every blow was filled with anger. Anger at the heat, at the drought, at their own powerlessness, and at these wild animals that had made them believe in the impossible. The first hour was the hardest. The men worked to the limit, taking turns every 10 minutes. The sun beat down mercilessly. Dust filled their nostrils and lungs, mixing with sweat and turning into dirty streams on their faces. They got through the top, hardest layer. Next came dry, rocky clay, exactly the same as in yesterday's pit. The hope that had barely begun to grow began to fade. "Stepan, it's empty here," one of the men croaked, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "It's the same as yesterday. We're wasting our last strength for nothing." Stepan, whose shirt was soaked through, silently took the pickaxe from him. "Let's dig," he said curtly, and brought the tool down on the bottom of the hole with a vengeance. He no longer believed there was any water. He was simply venting his anger, his fear, his humiliation. He dug because stopping was even more frightening. It would mean admitting complete defeat. The hole grew deeper, a meter and a half. The people in the village watched them silently. No one dared to leave. Everyone was waiting for something, a miracle or failure. Grandfather Zakhar kept his eyes on the horses. He saw how they stood. Their ears were pricked forward, their nostrils flaring. They were listening. They were listening to the ground. They knew what was happening there, beneath the feet of the people. And as long as they stood calmly, the old man had hope. And then, when the sun passed its zenith and despair had almost completely taken hold of the people, it happened. The pickaxe that Stepan was holding made a completely different sound with another blow. Not a dull thud against stone, but a squelching, wet crunch. Stepan froze. He slowly raised the tool. A lump of dark, greasy earth stuck to its sharp end. It smelled. It smelled of dampness, of the river, of life. Stepan stared at it in disbelief, then dropped to his knees and reached into the spot where the pickaxe had struck. His fingers sank into the damp, cool mud. "Water," he whispered. His lips wouldn't obey him. "Water." The whisper echoed across the pit. The men rushed toward him, pushing each other aside. They touched the wet earth, rubbed it in their palms, and sniffed it as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. The cry of joy that burst from hundreds of throats was like an explosion. It rolled through the village, sweeping up women and children who rushed to the stream with cries and laughter. Forgetting their fear and caution, they ran toward their hope. People hugged each other, cried, and laughed. Elena, clutching her son to her, looked at Zakhar, and tears of gratitude streamed down her cheeks. The old man stood, tears rolling down his wrinkled face. He wasn't looking at the people. He was looking at the herd. At that very moment, when the first trickle of clean, cold water broke through the ground, the led stallion raised his head and let out a long, drawn-out neigh. It was not a cry of threat. It was a cry of victory. And the entire 1,000-strong herd answered him with a deafening chorus. The sound seemed to shake the earth itself. It was a song of life, a song of the saved steppe. Having fulfilled its mission, the herd turned around. As organized and calmly as they had come, they began to leave. The wall of horses melted away, dissolving into the steppe haze. The last to leave was the rescued mare. She turned around, looked once more toward the village, at the old man standing by the spring, and snorted softly. It was a farewell and gratitude. Work at the spring continued late into the night. The hole was widened and reinforced. Water arrived with every passing minute, filling the dug pit. This was not just a spring. It was a powerful underground vein, capable of watering not only the village, but the entire surrounding area. When the first buckets, filled to the brim with clear, icy water, were brought to the village, people drank it as if they had never tasted anything sweeter in their lives. They watered their parched gardens and gave the exhausted cattle to drink. Life returned to Sukhodolye. When the initial excitement subsided, it was time to reflect. In the evening, the whole village gathered in the square. In the center, by the fire, sat Grandfather Zakhar and Stepan. The silence was long. No one knew where to start, Finally, Stepan stood up. He was without his rifle, without his usual armor of severity and authority. He looked tired and human. He approached Zakhar and, in front of everyone, silently knelt down before him. He did not ask for forgiveness. His gesture said more than any words could have. He, Stepan Gromov, a pragmatist and a cynic, bowed his head before the wisdom of the old man, which proved stronger than his strength. Grandfather Zakhar placed his gnarled hand on his shoulder. "Stand up, Stepan. You're not at my feet. You're in my heart." That evening, in the village of Sukhodolye, the old law of survival at any cost died. And a new one was born, the law of compassion. The story of how the old man gave his last meal to a wild horse, and the horse in return led a herd to save people from death, became a legend. It was told to children and grandchildren. The spring was named Zakharov. The wild horses never came so close again, but they were often seen on the horizon, like silent guardians watching over the small village that had learned a great lesson. A lesson that kindness given without expectation always returns. Sometimes in the form of a whole river in the middle of a dead desert. But the story did not end there. A week later, when life in the village had returned to normal and the first rains had finally washed the parched earth, Elena ran to Zakhar's house with a cry. But it was not a cry of horror. It was a cry of amazement. She was dragging her little son Mitya by the hand, who was clutching something in his fist. "Matveyich, look! Mitya found this by the spring, where the horses were standing," she said, breathless with excitement. The boy opened his palm. There lay a strange nugget, glimmering dimly in the rays of the setting sun. It was heavy and had a yellowish tint. Grandfather Zakhar took it in his hands and immediately knew what it was. In his youth, he had seen such things in old mines. It was gold. The gold nugget lay in the old man's rough palm, its dull sheen reflected in dozens of eyes. For a moment, the village froze again, but this time not out of fear, but out of shock mixed with awe. After weeks of despair, after hunger and deadly thirst, it seemed more than just a find. It seemed like a sign, a divine reward for their suffering and for the mercy of one old man. "Gold," someone whispered, and the word fell like a spark into a powder keg. The square exploded with a roar. People rushed to the spring, pushing each other aside. They dug into the wet earth with their hands, scooped up the mud, washed it in buckets of precious water, hoping to find more. And they found it. Small grains, a few smaller nuggets. The spring that had saved them from thirst turned out to be a gold vein that had been uncovered by the hooves of wild horses. By nightfall, Sukhodolye was gripped by gold fever. The joy of salvation quickly gave way to greed. Neighbors who had shared their last mug of water just yesterday now looked at each other with suspicion. Stepan Gromov saw this. He stood aside, and his heart, which had only just begun to thaw, tightened again with an icy foreboding. He saw how people's faces were changing, how the light of gratitude faded from their eyes and was replaced by a predatory gleam of greed. He understood that the water had quenched their thirst, but the gold had awakened a hunger that could prove far more dangerous. "Everyone stand still." His voice sounded like it did in the old days, harsh and authoritative. "Everything you found, bring it here immediately. This is common property. I'll count it all myself and decide how to divide it fairly." But the people had changed. Their fear of him was gone. "Why should you decide, Stepan?" shouted one of the men, hiding a bag of gold dust behind his back. "We've all suffered here. It should be divided equally." The crowd roared in support. Equal shares. Every family gets its share. We won't let the village head grab everything. The unity born of shared misfortune was cracking at the seams, ready to fly apart into 1,000 sharp, selfish shards. Stepan realized he was losing control. He wanted to resort to force again, to his authority, but he felt it wouldn't work. The village was on the verge of a new, far more terrible drought, a drought of humanity. And once again, Grandfather Zakhar found himself at the center of it all. He did not participate in the general commotion. He sat on the porch of his hut, holding the very first nugget in his hands. He did not look at it, but at the people, at their faces distorted by greed. And it hurt him. It hurt more than even hunger had ever hurt him. When the arguments in the square reached their peak and were about to turn into a fight, the old man slowly rose to his feet. He walked through the angry crowd, which involuntarily parted before his quiet calm. He approached Stepan, who stood red with anger and helplessness. Zakhar said nothing. He simply held out the golden nugget on his open palm. Then he pointed to the spring, from which clear, living water continued to flow. He looked around at everyone gathered and asked one very quiet question that everyone heard. What saved us? This stone? Or the water? Silence fell. It was so deep that you could hear the spring murmuring. The old man's words were simpler and purer than the gold in their hands. They were like the water that had washed their souls clean of the filth of fear and now washed away the filth of greed. The people lowered their eyes. They felt ashamed. They remembered the dead silence of the dried-up village. They remembered the taste of the first mug of water. They remembered the silent power of the wild herd. And they understood how small and insignificant this yellow curse was compared to the real miracle they had received. Alina was the first to approach Zakhar. She poured several gold nuggets from her handkerchief into the pile at Stepan's feet. Another followed her, then more and more. 10 minutes later, a small mound of gold had grown at the elder's feet. No one shouted about their share anymore. Stepan Gromov looked at the mound, then at Zakhar, and for the first time in many years, a smile appeared on his stern face. He finally understood everything. The true strength of a leader was not in coercion, but in unity. Not in dividing the spoils, but in increasing the common good. Thank you, Matveyich, he said quietly. Thank you for saving us again. They did not divide the gold they found. At a general council, it was decided to spend it on rebuilding the village. They bought the best seeds and young livestock, built a new school for the children, and laid an irrigation system from Zakharov's spring so that no drought would ever threaten them again. The dry land blossomed. The story of the old man and the wild horses became their greatest treasure, far more valuable than any gold mine. Grandfather Zakhar lived for several more years, surrounded by honor and love. He often sat on his porch, looking at the green fields, and sometimes he saw a dark, moving strip on the horizon. His wild friends. He knew they would not come again. Their mission was accomplished. They had taught their lesson, and the people had learned it. And every time he looked at them, he remembered that hot day and the simple choice he had to make. The choice between the last piece of bread and compassion. A choice that ultimately brought life to an entire world lost in the endless steppe. This story is not about a miracle. It is about how the greatest treasure is always hidden not in the earth, but in the human heart. And to find it, sometimes you just have to give your last to those who need it. And now that you know this story, ask yourself the same question as the residents of Sukhodolya. What would you do in their place? Divide the gold you found equally among all the families, or invest every last grain in a joint project for the future of the entire village.